This beautiful still life seems quite straightforward, and yet it's a painting which raises some intriguing questions. We don't know where it originally hung, nor who originally owned it. The objects were clearly designed to be admired, but also even possibly revered, like a religious icon. Indeed, it's very likely that there are hidden depths of meaning to this masterpiece. My name is Siân, and today we're going to be exploring Juan de Zurbarán's still life with lemons in a wicker basket. A large wicker basket weighs heavy with freshly picked lemons. You'll see some of the branches and glossy leaves are still attached. These fruits were, and indeed still are, abundant in the city of Seville, where Juan de Zurbarán lived from about the age of 9. His father, the well-known painter Francisco de Zurbarán, had moved from the region now known as Extremadura. The warm climate of the south was perfect for the cultivation of lemons and other citrus fruits, which had been introduced to the Iberian Peninsula during Islamic rule. The Muslim inhabitants of Islamic Spain had been present from the early 700s until the late 1400s, leaving an incredibly important legacy which defines much of Spanish culture still today, from science and literature to architecture and language and music and horticulture. Lemons were prized as culinary delicacies for the beauty and fragrance that they brought to gardens, and also for medicinal purposes. There's something very meditative about this painting. It's very calm, very still. Everything seems to have been very carefully placed and arranged. It's very balanced. The arrangement is punctuated by 2 white roses, a few red carnations, and some sprigs of white lemon blossom that we find here in the centre. We can also see some blue delphiniums on the left, and then some orange daylilies, and just a single tulip which juts out from the top left-hand corner of the composition. A branch of lemons has been placed to the right of the basket, whilst on the left a goldfinch perches gently on the edge of a porcelain bowl, looking towards a single daylily flower, whose petals are reflected in the smooth surface of the metal plate below. There's only the tiniest suggestion of movement, or I might say almost suspension of movement, with a very, very small droplet of water on the tulip at the top. And indeed, every time you look at the painting, you'll notice another of these exquisite details, like the pattern of deer with its head twisted on the porcelain cup, or the tiny delicate feet of the goldfinch perched on the cup's edge. So, how would this painting have been understood at the time? Zurbarán, Spain, was a deeply devout Catholic country, and people would have been brought up with a well-established language of sacred symbolism. So, for example, they would have understood that the inclusion of the lily and the rose were symbols of the Virgin Mary. Now, the lily that Zurbarán is actually showing us is a daylily, or Hemerocallis fulvae in Latin. It was native to Asia but brought to Europe in the 1500s. And it's called a daylily because its flowers just last for a single day. So not only would this have been considered something very expensive, but also we might interpret it as a vanitas. In other words, something that reminds us of the brevity of life and the inevitable passing of time. Red carnations, well, they can symbolize love, but they can also symbolize Christ's passion because their color was associated with Christ's blood. The blue flower, that's called a larkspur in English, but delphinium in Latin, coming from the word dolphin because its flowers look like little fish. So we could say that this could connect it to the well-known Christian symbol of the fish. For example, the flower appears in a famous manuscript called the Très Richeur around a miniature which depicts the narrative of Christ feeding the 5,000. We should probably add, however, that Juan most likely didn't have all these flowers in his studio at the same time because roses and carnations would bloom in summer as opposed to the tulip, which is a spring flower. So probably he would have modelled at least part of the composition using sketches. And finally, on the subject of symbolism, the little goldfinch, which can be identified by its distinctive red head, is often seen as a symbol of Christ's passion. Legend has it that a goldfinch flew down to remove a thorn from Christ's crown and was splashed with his blood, leaving a red spot on its plumage. The cup of water is associated with the purity of the Virgin Mary, and the lemon blossom in the centre has 5 petals, so we could perhaps say that this symbolises the 5 wounds of Christ. But I think the work also reflects or symbolises great national pride. Lemons and other citrus fruits were grown locally, but then proudly exported and thought of abroad as items of very great luxury. This can be seen in other paintings in the National Gallery. For example, the much earlier Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck includes a wealthy married couple living in Bruges, and if you look closely, you'll see just a few oranges on the chest and the window ledge on the left-hand side, which was symbolic of the couple's great wealth. Juan de Zurbarán's painting, on the other hand, is overflowing with them. Now, Seville was an incredibly important centre of trade and commerce, so it would have imported luxury items as well. And the cup that we see here is a very, very beautiful example of Chinese porcelain from the Ming Dynasty's Wanli period. And there's actually an example of this bowl in the Museo Naval in Madrid. It's very likely that the Zurbarán family had one in their workshop because a very, very similar example appears in a painting attributed to Juan's father, Francisco. The single tulip is also a symbol of great affluence and would have been considered very much a luxury item. In fact, in Juan's day, in the Dutch Republic, we know that a single tulip bulb exchanged hands for the same cost as a house. Still lifes, much like landscapes, were very popular with collectors, and they allowed artists like Juan de Zurbarán a chance to test their observational skills, exploring how contrasts of light and shadow define form, or how they create different textures from the knobbly pith of the lemon to the beautiful smooth surface of the metal plate underneath. They were also a chance for an artist to experiment with how objects were lit. Balance and structure and depth could be controlled through the manipulation of light or composition, breathing life into otherwise still objects. Here, Zurbarán sets everything against a very, very plain, dark, rich background with a very brilliantly lit foreground, making all the flowers and fruits stand out almost with a sculptural clarity or hyperrealistic presence. This technique is known as tenebrism, coming from the Italian word tenebroso, meaning dark or gloomy, which gives the painting a really dramatic clarity, so the objects almost, you might say, feel like actors on a stage, spotlit very brilliantly and effectively. In this case, the light is coming from the front left, casting shadows from left to right. Now, tenebrism is certainly a technique that he would have learned from his father Francisco, who applied it to his religious compositions, like this image of St. Francis in meditation, in which the saint is plunged into darkness, or also his still lifes, like this cup of water and a rose. And the cup of water and a rose has a lot in common with the left-hand section of the painting that we're looking at today, the cup filled with water, the reflection of a single flower in a metal surface, and also this great sense of stillness and quiet intimacy. I think it's also interesting to know that the cup of water and a rose has a really beautiful, authentic period frame, which the head of framing at the National Gallery, Peter Schade, used as the basis for creating a new frame for the Juan de Zurbarán painting when it came to the collection. However, although there are similarities between these paintings by father and son, there's also a key difference. The younger Zurbarán has created a painting which is much larger than life. In fact, it measures over 1 metre in width. Although we don't know who originally owned the painting, we can imagine it having an incredibly impressive impact on the wall of the home of a wealthy collector, perhaps with the source of light coming from a window on the left-hand side, mirroring the source of light in the painting. And its size alone tells us that it would have been very expensive to buy. Juan de Zurbarán was very well off by the time he painted it, in part thanks to marrying spectacularly well. His wife was a wealthy young woman from Seville called Mariana de Quadros. Juan seems to have enjoyed the finer things in life. We know that he learnt how to dance, for example. Now, dancing was an aristocratic or courtly pursuit, so associated with the nobility. And he even wrote a sonnet in honor of a man called Juan de Esquivel Navarro, who wrote a famous treatise on dance called Discourses on the Art of Dancing. And published in 1642, part of this treatise says, "Let him who is of good taste dance, for it is neither right nor fair that he who is noble born should in this skill be contrary, for the knight seems but a squire if he is not inclined to dance." Unfortunately, Juan seems to have squandered most of his large wedding dowry, because in his father-in-law's last will and testament, written just a few years later, he mentions that Juan had already spent most of it. Sadly, the painter's career was cut short when he lost his life during a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague that struck Seville in June 1649. The pandemic claimed about half of the city's population, and this is one of the reasons that we have so few works by him. And another reason is that his work was actually also later overshadowed by that of his father. Indeed, some of Juan's own paintings were later attributed to Francisco. And interestingly, Juan was only rediscovered in 1938, when a painting in Kiev, previously considered a work by his father, was cleaned, and it was found to have Juan's signature. Since then, a small body of his work has been established, and this painting was rediscovered in 2015 in a Spanish private collection before being acquired by the National Gallery in 2017. We're so fortunate to have this jewel of a painting in the National Gallery collection. It's the only known work by Juan de Zurbarán in a British public collection, and one of just a handful of fully attributed works by the artist. But watch this space, as I'm sure that more will be discovered in years to come.